are old enough, cast your mind back about 23 years. And that was when Y2K was first seriously talked about. But then
Right.
cast your mind back a little bit farther, back to the 60s. And back then, as I'm sure all of you recall, we used what are now commonly called IBM cards. That's because IBM called them IBM cards. They really were Hollerith cards. And they did have a part number on them also. But the thing is that they were 80 column cards. And when you use them for data, we used all 80 columns. When you use them for Fortran, you used one through used column
72.
6, I think, as a continuation column, and 73 through 80 was a
Sequence
sequence
number.
number.
Mhm.
And those of us who were smarter used every 10 for our sequence numbers because we knew that we were going to have to put new cards in the middle. And that made it easier when we dropped a deck of cards and you could pick them up and resort them.
How many people have dropped a deck of cards?
Oh, if you were a programmer, you dropped the deck of cards.
One of those
So
big trays.
back then, since we only had 80 columns for data, we couldn't afford to waste them. And as most people recall, dates were put in as 2-digit dates. So if it was 1960, it was just put in a 60. And that was fine for everybody. And nobody worried about it. In 1985, I wrote a paper that got published in Computer World, which back
Woo.
then was the newspaper that most people in business data processing at least read. And I suggested, I'm sure I wasn't the first person in the world to say this, but I suggested that sooner or later, this whole 2-digit date thing was going to become a problem. And I managed to convince about one person in all of Raytheon that I was right, and everybody else poo-pooed the whole thing and said, this is 15 years from now. None of these programs that we have today are going to be around in 15 years. Don't worry about it. So now jump forward to 1988. Well, it turned out that we were still using a large IBM mainframe for a lot of software. The cost to convert software was expensive. So we were moving into client server systems, but not for everything. And all of a sudden, people started talking about Y2K and said, when we move over to the year 2000 and we want to find the difference when you're doing some sort of a calculation between 1997 and 2001, and you subtract 2001 from 1997, you're going to get a negative number. And that's probably not a really good thing to do. So everybody in the US, it seemed all of a sudden, within about 6 months, was worrying about Y2K. And the first thing that Raytheon decided they had to do was to find a scapegoat. And they appointed me as being the guy in charge of Y2K. So I pulled together a team and we started thinking about what we could do. And the first decision that we made was, wouldn't this be a great opportunity to get rid of hundreds, if not thousands, of old COBOL programs? First of all, COBOL programmers were dying off or retiring. Secondly, the programs weren't documented as well as probably they should be. And it was hard to maintain them. And there were a variety of systems out there that were looked upon as opportunities to really change the environment. The one we ended up picking was SAP. And I'm not going to waste time talking about SAP, but the issue there is that SAP was an enormous system with capability to handle finance systems, manufacturing, purchasing, and others. And you would bring in their overall environment, and then you would write your specialized input programs and report programs and some of the extra calculations you had to do. So what that allowed us to do is get rid of
I
lots
assume
of
you
what
don't
we
want to
had,
hear this.
because after we put together a list of all the programs you had to look at to determine whether or not there was a problem, if you could get rid of thousands of them, well, then you just had less to look at. So SAP was brought in. That actually ran on a mainframe. But we also brought in a variety of client server systems, and that took work away from the mainframes and replaced
No,
things
nobody, I'm not
with
being seen.
with small servers and with a
Turned off.
lot of PCs. One of the side effects of all this, which no one really noticed instantaneously, is that we had to go out and buy a ton of new computers to run this new stuff, because we didn't have sufficient PCs or servers to do it. So I also had responsibility for all the PCs and client servers at the time. So my budget was increased, and I went out and I bought a whole bunch of stuff. And now let me just slide ahead for just a minute. Vendors were ecstatic because I was buying just a ton of stuff from them. When my budget for the year 2000 came up, my bosses cut it to about half. This is the hardware budget, cut it to about half of what it was back prior to the Y2K stuff. And the reason was we had already replaced a ton of stuff. We didn't need to buy a lot of hardware. The vendors came into me in a panic. And they said, last year you bought so many $1 million worth of stuff, and now you're buying $1.50. What's going on? And there are a number of companies, Sun being one, that almost went out of business in 2000. They had more problems later on because people just stopped buying. But now let's go back to what I was doing at Raytheon. So there were a number of categories of software that you had to worry about. You had all this business software, but you also had a lot of software that was built into things. It was built into airplanes. It was built into products that we had and used, but never thought about, like elevators. So we made a list of every place that we thought had a computer that might be affected by a change that maybe the BIOS couldn't handle. And when you start calling up Otis Elevator and say, by the way, do you think you have a problem with your elevator? Their answers were always, beats the hell out of me. And so as we got closer to December 31st, 30 days of September, yeah, December 31st, we just hoped that we had thought of everything that we had to think of. One of the directions that came out at Raytheon was that no one was allowed to fly on the night of December 31st, because everybody was a little nervous that something would happen to airplanes. And of course, although it should be obvious to all of us, you cross over to the year 2000 at 24 different times, depending on which time zone you were in. So I had my crew all around when the first time zone switched over in, I guess it was Australia or New Zealand, watching things and hoping that we weren't going to get a whole bunch of phone calls. Now, so what happened? So, well, the changeover arose, and I didn't get one phone from any saying that there were any problems. And the bottom, as best as I can tell by last month going back to Wikipedia and trying to check it out, is that there were relatively few things that happened. Now, I suspect that a lot of that is because we spent a lot fixing a lot of old stuff, and as a result, we didn't have problems. Here are a few things that I heard about I heard that a medical company somehow grabbed out-of-date medicines to incinerate, and they grabbed things that weren't out of date. Uh, I did hear that just like a year, the newspapers did a good job of raising the panic level of Americans and others, and therefore people stocked up on toilet paper and other things, and the stores ran out of toilet paper. People were stockpiling stuff, flashlights, toilet paper, other stuff. So I have
Toilet paper is the
oh,
worst.
what?
I said stale dated toilet paper is the worst.
Yeah. So I have a list that I'm not gonna read through of a bunch of things that happened. I'll mention a couple of things. Uh, there was a nuclear power plant in Japan where an alarm went off right after midnight. Turned out it wasn't the problem, but the alarm went off anyway. So I guess that was okay. Um, in Australia, a bunch of bus ticket validations didn't occur. A bunch of lottery machines in Delaware stopped working. Um, the U.S. Naval Observatory put out the official time on January 1st as being 1910. And there were a number of other silly things like that happened. One of the other things that I heard about, and I don't know whether it caused any problems, had to do with leap year. Leap year, of course, everybody knows leap year is every 4 years, but it's not exactly every 4 years because every 100 years it's not leap year, but every 400 years it is leap year. And 2000, therefore, is a leap year. And there were some pros that got confused about that. It doesn't really have much to do with this Y2K issue, but it does have to do with the fact that people sometimes are careless about dates. Um, so that's really the story that I had on it. It started off as a panic. It turned out to be a lot of work, but we updated a lot of systems, and that was good. And there were relatively few problems, almost none that I personally encountered and had to deal with. If any of the rest of you ran into anything.
Well, you mentioned COBOL. Did you successfully purge it with SAP?
We purged probably 80%.
I was working at a COBOL shop doing C++ and encountered a lot of hostility because of that at a commercial print mail facility. And the COBOL was an issue, but was too embedded. And basically they had to recompile their source code and make sure that it still worked and put it under control and a lot of provisions, but they kept the COBOL because it was integral to the banking environment they had. And so the COBOL lives on as far as from
The
my
problem here
situation.
is that most people who programmed COBOL are somewhere between 70 and dead. And
Yes.
so the shops that still have COBOL programs don't have COBOL programmers, and very few programmers who are thinking about their future want to be assigned to a task where they've got to learn COBOL.
So there was a big
They-
boom over in India where a lot of financial firms hired and trained young kids in India to learn COBOL just for Y2K. It probably didn't occur too much at Raytheon being a military operation, but a lot of financial and service firms had offshored that and trained a lot of COBOL programmers that no longer had jobs after Y2K passed.
They did that at the place. Did that at the place where I was. They grew their own COBOL programmers by using training account executives and others to program in COBOL. I left there before year 2K, so I don't know what happened to them after the rush was over.
So do you think there was very little trouble because people were, aggressive in trying to forestall trouble?
I personally believe that.
Wasn't much of a problem in the first place.
I think that what happened was a lot of companies upgraded their environments. And I don't mean just companies like Raytheon that had software. I mean people that had computers embedded in things. If you had a computer embedded in an airplane and you weren't 110% sure that everything would be just fine, it was easier to replace it. And I think that that's what we found a lot of. And I don't just mean where I worked. I mean, this was worldwide.
Wasn't there a suspense movie about Y2K where the bank robbers, the bank would have a half-second switch over and the bank robbers were going to worm their way into the computer system and rob the bank during that half-second delay? And then they would just empty the coffers and then close the door and be done with
Sounds
it.
like an Ocean's something movie.
It wasn't Ocean's 11. No, it was a suspense movie about that. I don't know if they ever got the money.
Ocean 8, Ocean 11, Ocean 12, Ocean 13.
Yeah, I worked for a software vendor at the time. And of course, we were asked by all our customers to provide certification that our product was Y2K compliant. And I imagine this was routine. You know, every company was looking to make sure that they had somebody else to blame if problems did arise. And they had enough lead time to really work on this. I think that there were a lot of problems, and they were discovered through careful due diligence, like you described.
Yeah, I truly believe that that's the case. It really wasn't just to get somebody else to blame. It was, you had to do something to make sure you were okay. And if a problem arose, let's say a program arose in a payroll system, say, well, if you can't put out checks for a week or two until you get it resolved, that's not like having a building fall down, but it's of significant concern to the employee base.
I have a minor comment. Coming up to Y2K, I was working on the development of a microprocessor-based crypto box. Now, in the crypto world, everything was using Julian dates. So the only place we ever saw a normal calendar date was an entry, a data entry, the key. And that was immediately changed to a Julian date. So all internal processing was done using the Julian time. And I could never convince, I still had to run every test that I was working for MITRE at the time. And they still had me do every corporate test for Y2K stuff, even though all the internal processing never used the normal calendar date. Just a comment.
I'm sure that no small company wanted to go out of business because all of a sudden some little glitch was discovered. So it was probably safer for them to say, we went through all these steps, because I know that part of my group's responsibility was to get letters from each of the vendors that we had identified saying that they had certified full Y2K compliance. And I'm sure it was an aggravation for a lot of people and maybe unnecessary for some or maybe many. But it was something that we demanded. And I'm sure that Raytheon wasn't the only company that demanded that. So a typical vendor would, I suppose, have gotten these requests from dozens, if not hundreds or thousands of different companies and the government.
Absolutely. Well, we were providing a database software that was used by telecom companies and financial services companies, and they had a lot of infrastructure at stake. So it was no laughing matter, very serious business. And happily, our software was the kind that didn't have a whole lot of dependencies on such formats. And so it was pretty easy for us to certify and credible for us to state that. But business software is a totally different story. It can be very complicated and difficult to test, and a huge problem for people. So it was really impressive that things didn't fail. I thought that it was testimony to a lot of care. So what you're describing is is good to hear, especially from a military supplier where if things went wrong, you could have genuine catastrophe. I personally went to Okinawa to not be in an urban environment on that day, partly for vacation, but partly just out of an abundance of caution, which sounds silly, but I thought that there was a lot more room for error than what we saw.
To go back to the SAP comment that I made earlier, when we started looking up all the software that we had, we found that we had a whole bunch of programs that had been compiled years before, and the compiler stuff was on decks and tapes, and the source code was gone. Couldn't find it. So even if you wanted to check it out, you couldn't. I mean, you might be able to test the program to see what happened with date changes, but if you found a malady, you couldn't go back because you didn't have the source.
That seems kind of like sloppy management somewhere. I mean,
Well, what you have to remember is that in a large company, you've got tens of thousands of programs. And I didn't say that this happened frequently. We just ran across a few because somehow the original source code got lost somewhere. Who knows how?
Yeah, that's not unheard of. I've worked in a office building in New York City where the elevators really worked poorly. And I remember talking with the technicians who were there, it seemed almost every day, doing something on it. And it turned out that one of the major problems they had was that they lost the source code for this elevator system. And that was major bummer for them. I imagine at some point they just replaced the whole thing.